¿Cómo están? How are you? Feliz viernes. My name is Ivan Salinas. I'm programs coordinator here at Beyond Baroque. Want to welcome you to the space. Beyond Baroque is an institution that has been around for 55 years. This year was our 55th anniversary. It's always a pleasure and honor to stand here and present emerging voices, established voices from all over the country and transnationally. And it's been a great pleasure working with the team. 2023 is going to be behind us in just a few weeks, but it's been a great year. Do want to give a land acknowledgement. We are on unceded territory of the Tonga peoples. We acknowledge the wrong done to indigenous communities through genocidal practices, the violent dispossession of their land. But as an arts organization, we are committed to uplifting their stories, cultures, peoples. We stand in solidarity with indigenous communities. Be on the lookout for the slate of programming that we have for next year. We do events every Friday, Saturday for the most part, but you can also visit the space and check out the wonderful gallery exhibits. Right now, we actually have two. We have some work from Rafa Cardenas, and in the Mike Kelly Gallery, we have the great work of Bob Brannaman. Very surreal. Upstairs, if you haven't been, upstairs is where you can find the rest of the exhibit. But we offer multidisciplinary programming here, and it's been happening ever since the space opened. And we are a staple now of not just the West Side, but in general over LA, of Los Angeles, supporting writers and artists. You can support the space in many ways. Become a member of Beyond Baroque. There's a lot of perks that come with that. With our programming, you can have discounts on it, as well as in our bookstore, there's discounts that we offer with selection of books. And we have memberships that start as little as $50, and it goes up from there, but you'll be supporting the space and all the free programming that we have on a yearly basis. You can also support by getting a book. Today, we have this special, one and only Poetics of Fire by Valle. We have copies available just across the hall, and you can get it signed after. I'm sure our poeta and historian, author, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and everything will be happy to sign it. I think it's truly an honor, because Victor came to us wanting to host this event here and be in community with us, share space. After that, it was wonderful to just know more about you and your legacy, really, in journalism and nonfiction, all the wisdom you have. And now with this new book on the history of Chile, but it's so much more than that. It's a whole exploration of Mesoamerican indigenous peoples, Mexica people, and incorporation of Chile in the culture and the language, and even its effects after colonization, assimilation that happened from Spanish colonization, and specifically in Mexico. And so I'm like 2 chapters deep in the book, but I have a long way to go. It's just, we were just talking about it, and I think that you find a lot about like a connection to our history, like as mestizo, as a Mexican person. I was born in Mexico City, a settlement that is what used to be or stands still with Tenochtitlan. And it's just really insightful, deep to know more about this thing, Chile being part of a long history of like part of our culture, part of our bloodline, that it's not just thing there in our day-to-day cuisine. So I think we'll get more of an experience about that as we also experience the food of our culinary artists of Baja California. After the conversation with Victor and Patricia, we'll have a bit of a tasting, and Carlos from Baja California will tell you a little bit more about what we'll experience outdoors. Lastly, if you all were paying attention to the music that was playing, I just want to give a huge shout out to starting with our music selectors of the evening, with Jimena Minota Martin, Director of Public Programs at Plaza de Cultura y Artes, Beto Arcos, who's with us, music journalist, and El Que Amo, Alfredo, who will be also DJing outside as we and of course to our culinary artists, as I said, of Baja California. So there'll be a bit of conversation about the book and what Victor has spent so many years researching and just dedicating, committed to exploring more the history of our gente. And he will say, him and Patricia will say things more eloquently than I ever will. So just so that you know a little bit more about them, Victor M. Valle is a professor emeritus at California Polytechnic State University at San Luis Obispo, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and Chicano author. He writes extensively on urban politics, economy, and food for a variety of media outlets, including the LA Times and Gastronomica, the Journal of Food Studies. He's the author of Recipe of Memory, 5 Generations of Mexican Cuisine, and other books, including poetry and anthologies of Latinx writing. And Patricia Escarcega is a writer and journalist based in Los Angeles. Her work has appeared in the New York Times and Playboy. She was the first restaurant critic of color at the LA Times, where she took a stand against unequal pay. Currently, she writes a newsletter called Extra Juicy. So check out our authors after the reading, but let's give them a round of applause and hear from them. Yeah. Awesome. Where you went?
Victor, do you have a preference? I guess you're standing there.
Well, this is fine.
Is that okay? Okay. Twirling here.
I'm kind of looking at you because the sun, the light is quite bright.
Okay, well, first I want to thank you all for coming out. I know there's a million things you could be doing on a Friday night in West LA, but thank you for being here. I want to thank Beyond Baroque for hosting us, and for the people that will be feeding us tonight and making the night so special with music, and of course Victor. I want to thank you for writing this book, which if you see my copy, he overnighted me a copy last week, and I just filled it with writing, which I think is a good sign. It's a book. I've been describing it as dense and intense. There is a lot in this book, and that I mean that in the most, the highest form of a compliment. There is so much that I learned from reading the book, and I think if you dive into the book at any point, you can learn something new or have an important but pretty profound shift in the way you think about the world, which I think is one of your intentions with writing it. But to start off, I want to ask you a little bit. We're at Beyond Baroque, a legendary site for literature in Los Angeles, and an important community, not community center, but an important kind of third space for LA's literary community. And so obviously this is a place where we welcome different ways of thinking, and where we use language to, explore different worldviews. And the title is The Poetics of Fire, Metaphors of Chile Eating in the Borderlands. Why, when we talked on the phone for a couple hours the other day, and you said, I just decided I was going to do an eco-poetics of Chile. And I know why. I know there's a million reasons, but I thought maybe you could, you've written about so many things. Why did you decide to make Chile the focal point for such an ambitious project? And I know from there, maybe we'll pull apart a few threads from that.
Well, it's the idea for the book started in 1996 when I was with my editor, Don Davis. Oh, do I need to get closer or like this? Okay. 1996, Recipe of Memory have been nominated for a James Beard Award and a Julia Child Award, not for the recipes, but as culinary history, as literature, as nonfiction literature. And she said, well, Victor, what are you going to do next? And feeling very overconfident, I said, well, I think I can do something on the aesthetics of Mexican food. He said, as a system, right? And I didn't know what I was talking about. I didn't realize that I was unprepared to do that, but I didn't forget. So I wrote other books, and I kept on going back to that. And I realized, well, what would be the entry point? I began to read sort of what was then available about what Europeans and Americans were writing about food as aesthetic art, as a form of aesthetically, right? As aesthetic philosophy of culinary art. And there wasn't very much. And what there was, and for a long time, and still, there's kind of debate going on whether it's even possible to talk about food as culinary art. And that's an ongoing debate. Some people have made some progress, but it felt very incomplete. So I was reading that, and at the same time, I began to hear about the critique of going back to Aristotle. Aristotle uses that idea of poetics, of talking about what is beauty, and he uses that term, and it's not coincidental that we're here at Beyond Baroque, a center for poetry, and so I kept that in mind. But I also saw that Aristotle really didn't think food merited to be discussed as art. Later, Hegel, the same idea. They all had different reasons. Immanuel Kant said it's not really, it's too ephemeral. You eat the art, so how can it last? I mean, there's all these reasons why they say this is not. But it had to do with the fact that at that time, and not until the middle of the 20th century did people begin to talk about art as experiential, as performative, right? Okay. But in the culinary arts, no one had sort of done the math and say, okay, how does this idea of this late 20th century, early first 20th century ideas of art, no longer mimetic, no longer based on the metaphor of the mirror, but on what people are feeling, experiencing, the senses, where we're talking about starting from the body. This is all notions of embodiment, but it was still not coherent, right? So then I said, well, what if I told this story, go back, and do it from a point of view of an ingredient that does not really figure that much in Western ideas of culinary art. It's very important. Europeans are eating more chili than ever, but they hadn't really philosophized it, like Briand Savarin and all those old cats from the 18th century. Said, so what if that is my starting point? And what if I incorporate a Mesoamerican, the people who domesticate these capsicum annum, starting somewhere 8,000, 7,000 BC. There's like a 2,000-year period where they go from experimentation to actually domestication. So I said, so that was the journey. How do I do that? And in the process, which incredible journey, I had to deal with, well, how do Mesoamericans see the body? In other words, if we're talking about this kind of idea of embodied art, then and what is their idea of metaphor? So all these other things begin to take place. And I was fortunate to come up to meet or to read the works of Daniel Dehouve, a French anthropologist, who was at that time doing a work on the poetics of present-day Tlaxcaltec food and culinary ritual, the use of Chile in ritual, even in government investitures. When a person becomes the mayor of a town, he has to eat really, really hot chili to prepare them for the struggle of being a mayor of a town. I mean, there's this whole. And I said,
We should make them do that again.
I think it's totally appropriate. Can you take it?
Yeah.
And so at that point, I began to, and one of the things that happened, I was in Mexico City at this point. I had done a presentation at Radcliffe at Harvard, and I laid out the aesthetic theory of Chile poetics based on the work of Timothy Morton, and it was very helpful because now we were saying, well, there's nothing to represent visually, because when you eat a certain food, and chili is very aggressive, I mean, it really tells you your body is having another kind of experience, that you're inside a sensorium, you're inside of an orb of sensation. And so it's a whole different way of talking about it. So that was very helpful. I was able to say, okay, I can take the idea of poetics literally, not in a very descriptive notion. So no, we're going to talk about metaphor, and we're going to talk metaphors of the body, and metaphors of the body revealed through chili eating. So, and then later, I'm in Mexico City. I read this story. It was a legend as a kind of a poem. It is a poem. It's called The Legend of the Toweño. And this is a story. The story is actually a Toltec story as remembered by the Mexica or the Aztecs. So this story goes back 800 AD, and it's about a chili vendor who goes into the plaza, and not in Tenochtitlan, but in what is now called Tula. This is a Toltec. We don't know the actual name of that place. They call it Tula now. So this is going back in time, and this is a chili vendor who is actually a god. He's Tezcatlipoca Titlacahuan, right? Who's a shapeshifter, and he goes and he seduces the emperor's daughter by selling chilies in the plaza without his loincloth. So he has chilies in front of him and chilies before him, right? And so, hence, there's an incredible story departs from that. I won't say anymore. So then I realized, oh, this is a poem. It's actually a poem, and it's about how the Mexica, understood the body and chili, what they feel, everything. And so then I began, and then I discovered in that process, I was reading the Florentine Codex, which is this major work that Bernardino de Sagaon, one of the chroniclers, goes, and he rounds up all the tlacuilos, or all the scribes, before they are killed, because a certain number of them they killed them immediately. They didn't want any intelligentsia remaining. But of the few that survived, he was able to get a group of people, and they say, okay, you guys, tell me the story. Tell me your story. And in 16 volumes, it's this huge, incredible work. It's now digitized, which thankfully allowed me to find a metaphor that kept on recurring. A metaphor that was so ordinary that was overlooked, because a lot of the analysis of Mexica or Nahua poetry was focused on the poetry of Nezahualcóyotl, Starving Coyote, right? On the the elite, and he even ran a conference of poetry, like 100 years before what do you call it?
The original AWP.
The original AWP, right? They had a certain, and they were drinking chocolate with mescaline, So they were, they was having all these incredible feasts they would have. So there's
dissipation.
Yes, and there was a whole thing going on, but most of the scholars were looking at that, because this is the high poetry, the elite poetry, but not in the poetry of everyday life. But in everyday life, there was a saying, an expression, in testatl in chilitl, or in chilitl in testatl, which is a diphrase. It's two things to say: the chili, the salt. And in Nahua poetics, those two elements, they have meaning of their own, which I explain in the book. I'm not going to quote what they mean at all. They're already, would say, metonyms. They already have a metaphorical value, but when you put the two diphrases together, you create a third-order metaphor that there's a whole other concept. And so then I began to realize, well, this term keeps on showing up in the Florentine Codex. And I was talking to Danielle in France, and she says, yes, and no one has bothered to do this, So then this whole but it was very slow, because the number of texts you have to go through, the effort was a lot.
I bet. And one of the things we learned in the book is how that diphrase is profoundly misunderstood
Yes.
by the Spanish. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. And this is the point where at the beginning of the book I have to talk about ontology, right? And this is a challenge, and this is still the challenge. I think this book is not perfect, and it's not perfect not because the native people were not good at expressing who they are. We have a language that is not really adequate to their poetry. It's very difficult. We constantly have to correct for that, to adjust for that. And one of those things had to do with the Spanish were very reluctant to engage these people philosophically. For example, they would criticize the Mexica healers, other Mesoamerican healers, as being too empirical. You can imagine that, because their ideas of the body, and this is going, the poetry, all metaphors in poetry, so my colleagues say, emerge from the body. In one way or another, the metaphors that we are talking about, if you go deep enough, you'll see they all emerge from the body. And so for the priests, what they were saying, for the Mexica, this, and for the people, the Nahua people, this meant, the chili, the salt, meant all that is pleasurable in life, all that makes life worthwhile. And you could interpret that as the spice of life, except that what they meant by that exists in another world. It's ontologically different. And for example, chili symbolizes heat. So what does that mean? And what does it have to do with the body? So I go into all of that of how this metaphor actually unlocks another world, another way of seeing the body. And for the Spanish, and one of the things that really, the Spanish confounded them, that we were talking about this cosmology that you could think of as very spiritual, and what it is, at the same time, it was very based in materiality, right? And for a Christian, they want to make a division between spirit and body. And here you had, once you got into their philosophy, you realize, no, they don't make that division. Those binaries do not exist. They don't have an idea for nature. Everything is nature. There is no outside or inside of nature, right? And so at a certain level, the Catholics and the friars, they're afraid of it, because it would force them to have a different view of this deeply ecological view of reality, that, and that what they would call a living materiality, which is kind of a contradiction for Christians. It's either matter or it's not matter. It's spirit. No, here we have this idea where you're talking of both at the same time. And for me, it was a constant check for me to go back and say, stop projecting what you think reality is, right? And listen to what's going on here. And so in order to explain that metaphor, you have to understand, well, what was the Mexica view of the body? And what does heat mean in that sense? So in the poem of the Toqueño, they talk about heat. In other words, the metaphors are already talking about the body, and so it's just, I began to realize, so it was very challenging. And then over time you realize that these metaphors they don't go away. And Alarcón, this persecutor of indigenous people, looking out for shaman and for the disciples, that's what they were called, the healers. He interpreted that metaphor as just simple, your goods, your belongings, right? And then he said all the rest is idolatry. He didn't want to deal, and he said this is impenetrable poetry. But when you read this is his treatise on superstition. So he is basically capturing all these healers and torturing them to recount their practices. And in that, you get the story of Mariana, of how she is basically tortured. They were stripped naked, put in stocks, and made to walk through the cities for practicing this, this knowledge, right, of the body. So he interprets that metaphor in one way and does not recognize that metaphor's existence in this other reality, in this other ontology. So now you get an idea of what, and Chile is I want to say one more thing. Chile is really important. It has its own God. There is our Nuestra Señora del Chilito Rojo, Our Lady of the Little Red Chili Pepper, and she is the sister of Chicanx, which is Our Lady of Sustenance. Our Lady of Sustenance was basically in charge of all seeds all plants, all animals, and it was everything that created life and that humans needed for life, right? She had that domain, which included all the domesticated cultivars of Mesoamerica, corn, camotes, peanut. There are incredible cornucopia of foods that were domesticated. But Chile had its own goddess. Now, these two sisters were the sisters of nothing less than Tlaloc, the Earth Lord. One of the most important deities in Mesoamerica. There's an equivalent to him that exists in the Maya culture. In all the Mesoamerican cultures, you have this Earth Lord, who is both the earth and the deity. And so it's like, there you have that again, where the two concepts are like meshed together. And so these were his sisters, and one of them, she was a deity on her own, the little Chile. And why little Chile? And that's a whole other mystery. I have a theory of what they were talking about. I can't prove it yet. But I think the tiny diminutive in Chilito, which is like, the diminutive form, Chilistli, which is like in Nahuatl, you give something the diminutive to actually say it is noble. It is princely, or it is the opposite of what it sounds like, right? You say, the prince, oh, my dear little prince, but you're actually acknowledging the authority of that prince. And so it's a funny way in Malintzin, that sin is put at the end of her name to mean the diminutive, but actually it's an honorific, and so what happens then is that I forgot. I'm gonna so she has their own deity, and so it tells you how important this was. In other words, she's in the highest order of the cosmology of these people. So this is so then again you're in a different world, and the meaning that it has for these people was something, it wasn't just a commodity in that sense. So I'm sorry for my moment, my senior moment.
We all have those. One of the things I was thinking about as I was reading was Victor had to be a historian, he had to be an anthropologist, he had to be an economist, he had to be everything in order to write this book. It's very transdisciplinary, and we talked a little bit about that. And I think in order to, for instance, you have a chapter about New Mexico and the importance of Chile there. But in order to get to that, we need to learn a little bit about how Chile's got to New Mexico.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, because this is history I feel like we don't hear about a lot.
Yeah. So when I was looking at all the text, and because in New Mexico loves to be very proud of, because basically this is where industrial chili growing begins. New Orleans had its Tampico chilies, but that wasn't an industrial. It wasn't industry. So New Orleans and New Mexico are the two places where chili industry begins, right? New Mexico has its own particular history, and so it's the history of a commodity. What you're talking about. How does capitalism interpret Chile? Because you're going through, what I'm going through too is a critical process. I'm dealing with all these colonialities, right? How do the Spanish use, for example, Pietro Martire, Peter Martyr, the chronicler to the Pope. Never goes to the New World, but he's getting all the chronicles coming from Sebastian Cabot, Columbus, and he's getting all this intelligence coming from the Western Hemisphere, and he is writing what are called the decades. And these are reports basically to the elites of Europe. Shakespeare will eventually get an English translation of the decades, and hence a lot of the ideas of Caliban. And so he talks about Chile as being, Caribe, right? Meaning Carib, the people who lived on the Caribbean, and according to Columbus, these people were cannibals and the fiercest people. So they called the fiercest Chile Caribe. So there you get this association with cannibalism, idolatry, the worst. I mean, when you call someone a cannibal, it's not merely that they're not human, they are antithetical to being human. This is the most extreme form of outcast you can be, if you think about that. So that's like that marking moment of how, and what happens is this maize and corn and a few cultivars become metonyms for Indian difference, and eventually They will even have a term for this. They will say la comida de los indios, the food of the Indians, y la comida de los cristianos, the food of the Christians. And it's an echo of a phrasing that occurs in the Doctrine of Discovery, by the way, where the Pope in a series of papal bulls says, you have the right to do whatever you want, kill anyone, enslave anyone, if you bring the book. Yeah, this is the basis of European, one of the bases, not the only one, but it's one of the key documents. The Pope will write these 3 papal bulls to say, boys, give me what you, go bring me the stuff back. Bring it back, And so
Bring the 5th.
Huh?
Bring the 5th.
Yes, exactly. Bring it back, by any means necessary. So what happens is, this story, what happens is in New Mexico, they have a rub called salsa caribe, right? So, 16th century, 20th century New Mexico, these words appear again. There are certain things, echoes of things I thought would never occur, but when you do a genealogy and you're complete, following as much as the available record you can, all of a sudden these weird paradoxes and echoes appear. So in New Mexico, they would tell the story of Juan de Oñate, whose statue they knocked down back during the pandemic. And so they gave him the credit for bringing Chile to New Mexico. And the story goes that immediately the Spaniards loved Chile and everybody was happy. And they didn't explain, and this is what I had to undo, that it's really very hard to tell. There's a story that New Mexicans tell about themselves, their backstory to Chile, which is not verifiable ultimately. We know it gets there. People do grow chili, but how it actually happened and that somehow the Spanish were in the middle of this is not provable, right? And the other thing that I learned is that the Spanish, in order to go that far north, right, they went through a whole series of negotiations with the Tlaxcalan people, and in order, because the Spanish were having a hell of a time getting beyond Nueva Galicia. They could not pass what is today Jalisco. They couldn't pass Acaponeta, that river there, the Rio Acaponeta was like a barrier. There was constant warfare, for about 90 years of warfare on both those routes. The Pacific route, you could only go by sea. If you try to go by land, you're going to hit the Yaqui, the city. It was just resistance, and they're in the mountains, and the horses lose their advantage in the mountains, and then same on the other side. So finally, the Pope, and then at the same time, people are dying. The genocide, no one understood what was happening. No one knew why it was happening. This was probably one of the biggest genocides in human history, but it was almost like it didn't happen because it wasn't known, because it wasn't recorded. It was all anecdotal. The Spanish did not have an idea of medicine that they could explain. No one really understood what was happening except just mass death. And some communities would survive and not be affected for 100 years, and 100 years later they would be. It was this continuous process. At a certain point, the Spanish, through war with these people, and where the gold was in Jalisco, Nueva Galicia, Nueva Vizcaya, all the way up to New Mexico, it's on the mountain chain there. And so people are dying. They didn't have, the indigenous population were quickly plummeting, and so they couldn't get the gold. So not only they have resistance, they don't have laborers. They don't have the people to do this work. So the church had to intervene again and say, okay, wherever you go, you're going to plant corn. They just made a policy. You're going to grow the foods that the miners will eat, that mestizos, people of mixed race, and indigenous people will eat, because these are the ones who are doing the labor in the mines. Grow the food that will keep them alive. That's basically, they make this shift, and it works. But in the process, these people have, they're basically walking up along the Camino Real del Interior, the interior Camino Real. We have the Pacific one on the ocean here. Well, this is the interior one. This is the first one they shot up from Mexico City, all skirting the Sierra, the western Sierra, but on the eastern side, all the way up to Zacatecas, Chihuahua, all the way up to New Mexico. So they need, and this is why the Tlaxcalans were so crucial, because eventually they had these negotiations where even there's a Tlaxcalans go all the way to Spain in the regalia to go before the Spanish court, and they had to seal the deals. And the Spanish said, okay, you will have the rights of noblemen. You will have the rights to create cities. We will not tax you, right? They gave them all the rights of free and equal people, because for other indigenous people, no such thing. If you resisted Catholicism in any way, you could be enslaved. there was the law of the Indies that protected Christianized native people, but if you refuse to accept the truth of Christ, we can enslave you, right? And but that wasn't working. So they bring the Tlaxcalans along, and after much negotiation, reluctance, and deal striking, they said, okay, they begin to form a series of cities, but what they also do is they were master gardeners in their own domain. So they knew about hydrology, about how to do aqueducts, irrigation, and then, but then they realized that only a certain number of the cultivars of Mesoamerica could travel into the desert. Chile could survive in the desert. Maize could grow. Squashes could grow. Tomatoes. But there, remember, there's a huge, 60-some cultivars in Mesoamerica. Incredible variety of fruits. Only 6 or 7 of those cultivars. The beans could travel, right? But not a lot. So the Tlaxcalans said, if you want us to found these cities, then we're going to have to reinvent an agriculture. We're going to have to reinvent the Mexican food, in essence. And this is like one of the first. Well, the first draft is Criollo interpretation with the Creole, the Europeanized, the Spaniards born in the New World, what they imagined the food to be. And they were very conservative, very reluctant to eat indigenous food. They did when they absolutely have to. They love chocolate, however, and they like pineapples. So they like certain things, but a lot of this other food said, no, we don't really like corn. It's too bland. I mean, they didn't want it. And then the indigenous farmers that survived, they would grow Western cultivars for the Spanish, wheat, barley, but they weren't really interested in that. At first, this is in central Mexico, but now when they have to go north, the Tlaxcalans and their allies, the Purépecha, the people of Michoacán, other groups, but mainly the Tlaxcalans were the head of this. They said, okay, we're going to have to invent an agriculture for the desert. And we're going to have to invent irrigation for the desert. So one of the things they do from the Franciscans, they learn about all kinds of things you could grow in the desert. And here it's the food of North Africa, the food of southern Spain, the Mediterranean food. Primarily fruits are really important. And the techniques of desiccating fruit, of drying fruit. And so, but at the same time they're doing this, they're testing chilies, what chilies will grow. And so there's this whole process that takes decades for them to figure that out. And each step along the way, they are figuring out what will work, what will not work. And so you're getting the capsicanums, there's about 7 that will travel well, like the chilaca chilies or the long chilies, from whence the New Mexican chili will come from. But they come in 3 colors, There's all this variety. The chile puya is one of them. Chile cascabel is another one. All the Western, what you're getting there is that those chilies that grow from Nueva Galicia all the way up to Chihuahua, and it's along that interior corridor. So it's not an accident that the largest chili producing states in Mexico are Zacatecas and Chihuahua. They produce the lion's share of chili, and it's in that moment where their industries begin. So one of the difficulties I had going back to economics, the challenge is that at a certain point, the Spaniards will teach indigenous people to write. But they want no evidence of their cosmology. Anytime they were policing them, it's all right for indigenous people or mestizos to write legal records, property records, marriage certificates. They could do all the writing that was serve the empire. But anything that hinted of what the Catholics saw as idolatry, no. The Inquisition was on them again, right? So it's difficult once you get to like the 1700s to know exactly what they're doing this. We know they did it because by the time they arrive in New Mexico, this whole other form of agriculture emerges. Oh, I forgot to mention that the Tlaxcalans will go into what is now San Buenaventura, where my ancestors are from in Chihuahua, and they will discover the remnants of Puebloan irrigation systems. The people along the Rio Bravo, the Rio Grande, well, that was called the Mogollon culture, and in archaeology, it's what you call it. But these are Puebloan, ancestors of the Zuni Pueblo, those people, right? Well, I didn't realize it, but wherever they found rivers of any size, they would go into those areas and they would develop irrigation systems. So in what is now Casas Grandes, or what was called Paquime, and in San Buenaventura, where my grandmother was from, they were the remnants of those irrigation systems, and the Tlaxcalans got them running again. It's amazing. And you can go into those cities in Casas Grandes and certain neighborhoods, and you will see the remnants of those dikes and of that whole irrigation system. So they're figuring this out, and one of the things that Tlaxcalans discover that is hugely important, and which the Spanish Jesuits and Franciscans teach them, is Indo-Arab. They invent Indo-Arab hydrology, Indo-Arab irrigation. In other words, the water systems, the water technology for growing in deserts is Arabic, is model. And the Spaniards inherited that. They brought it, and they not only brought the technology for growing in the desert, they brought the law that goes with it. And one of the things that Muslim cultures realize is you cannot own water. In a desert, if you want water, it's impossible for water not to be public, for not to be a commons. And so what the Tlaxcalans inherit from the Muslims is the idea of the water commons. Mm-hmm. And they take that legal system, which still exists in New Mexico today. I have friends whose backyards connect to the irrigation system. And so they take that up, and that becomes a really important thing of how you live, how you grow in agriculture in the desert. So what happens is, by the time we get to the 1700s, all along the borderlands, especially in New Mexico, these people are growing, the whole, not just chili, but corn and all these other things. So, the native people were already using corn in there. So this other system develops. And but when you read the stories nowadays, these people, their bodies are absent. We were talking about the idea of metaphors of the body, but here, when you tell what they had told, the series of stories of New Mexico, the Tlaxcalan bodies are absent. But now, the recent archaeology, recent work in history and economics, you can tell that story again, not from the mouths of those people, because that wasn't really allowed, but from what they did. And you're telling a history of technology, a history of plant sciences, a history of cuisine. So that's what you end up getting this whole process. And so my effort was to write these people back into the history of that you wouldn't have had New Mexico and Chile were it not for these Mesoamerican settlers. That's what they were. They were they were settler colonialists too. That's the complication here. The Spanish, these people are under the protection of the Spanish, right? And so that's a whole another story to tell. And the book talks about that too. This entangled identities, where these are diasporic native people. They're from Mesoamerica, but now they're in the Southwest. And how do the native people of the Southwest? And I have some of that in there. And so, to be a mestizo Chicano, we have to deal with that complexity. You cannot pretend that it didn't happen, right? And so there's a whole other. I talk about that as well. But what is clear, without this economic history, and it's a paradox, because here you have the conquest going on, but in the process of expanding the empire, the Spanish are also spreading Chile. It's like they're encouraging it, because they know the people they're going to have to feed want to eat these foods. They don't want to eat European. They want to have their diet. And so the Tlaxcalans are in the middle of reinventing what that diet is, because they can't take all of it. And so that's what we're talking about. So, but a lot of this work is very recent, and a lot of disciplines, a lot of people who are specialists in hydrology, irrigation systems, all this other stuff. And so part of the challenge, and even genetics was interesting. Stanford did a study. They were set out to look at, sort of map the genome of diabetes, the 4 markers of diabetes among Mexican populations, because they know they have a large amount of native DNA. When they actually geolocated their samples, there's 2,500 samples they took. It was a huge study, because one of the problems, there's not enough genetic studies of Mexican and Latino populations. So how do you develop medicines for that? How do you develop treatments? So their purpose was not initially to do anthropology, but after they had completed it, and after they had mapped each of their samples, the dots on the map end up recreating the Camino Real del Interior. Basically, here you have the spread of genes occurring with the spread of technology. And it's actually literally a map. You can see it. It's all the points at which these people intermarried or interbred with indigenous populations. And when I did my Ancestry.com, my genome, the map is basically the same. Is it? Around the Lake Chapana, that's part of my genetics goes there, and the other part is in Chihuahua, up way at the top, along the highway, along that route. And so, and the scientists who did this, the genetic scientists who did this study, said this is very important because they were able to map the DNA markers in this population. Said, but by the way, this has great cultural historical significance because it ends up recapitulating what the stories are told, but now through to genetic means, So a lot of this stuff was recent, and so the challenge was to put all of this stuff together to tell the story again, to suggest it, and to invite people to say, if you think I'm wrong, prove me wrong, or find another way to explain this, because there's, and this is like, and it's let's get away from the Spanish heritage, this, or the Spanish fantasy, this idea of overvaluing Spanish sources and not hearing native sources. So that's what that chapter was about.
It's a great chapter, the New Mexico one. I think will make a lot of people maybe a little angry.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about Fabian Garcia. I don't know where are we at in time, Ivan?
Now,
time for one more question.
One more question.
one more question. Okay, Fabian Garcia, this is a whole other story. I didn't expect, part of the challenge was that the story kept on taking me in all these directions, okay? So my friends in New Mexico said, you gotta talk about Fabian, you gotta talk about Fabian. So I did. So this is a guy who, in 1926, correct me if I'm wrong, he basically gives the results of a Chile breeding experiment. And what happened was he was a student earlier, 1901 to 1902, or 1900 to 1901. He was a student of Liberty Hyde Bailey at Cornell University. And Liberty Hyde Bailey is this, during the first maybe 20 years in genetic science, that's what we're talking about, early genetic science, he was a Darwinian, right? A strong evolutionist. Later on, the Mendelians will take over, but in that period, he's very influential, and his idea is the biocentric plant breeding, right? He's into this very, like pre-ecological. He wasn't using the word ecology, but he was definitely saying, if you want to develop foods for Americans, in the 50 states, he said, you have to incorporate wild or native cultivars, because the European cultivars won't work here. And he did all this work with, Luther Burbank was doing that with plums. And so during this period where people are doing the experimentation, so Fabian Garcia, he was an orphan, originally from Chihuahua, right? So he's born in Mexico, he's an orphan, and his grandmother takes him across the border. At a certain point, his parents die. So she takes him across the border, and he's raised in the Casad family. They own 15,000 acres. These are rich, wealthy Anglo ranchers, farmers along the border, right? And so he comes across, so eventually he's a really bright student. He goes to the beginning of their ag school there in New Mexico, will become New Mexico State University, that'll become that later. So he goes off to Cornell. After he graduates with his BA in agriculture, agronomy, I forgot the term. I have all the details in the book. He goes to study at Cornell, and he becomes a staunch Darwinian. Okay, and so what does he do? He does a lot of other things. He's actually more successful with other cultivars, developing pecans, onions, melons. He said, okay, New Mexicans need to have their own agriculture, and we have to modernize it, right? And he had all these attitudes of what is modern, right? And he had a negative view of what was native. He said, the native people, they did these things, but it's not all that great. I said, we have to make it scientific and modern. So I don't hide his contradictions. I know a lot of New Mexicans are going to be angry because they like to hold him as a great founding figure, and he is. He's very important, right? I found articles that he wrote on Darwin, quoting from notebooks that only the specialists read, because Darwin's notebooks were not that easily accessible on the ascent of man, origin of species. Those were published books. But his other more important work, especially dealing with gardeners in England, right? All his notebooks. Well, he's quoting from those. I said, oh, okay, he's into the literature. And so what does he do? He recreates an experiment the way Liberty Hyde Bailey told him to do it. And what you do is you get as many varieties of a cultivar, and as many that are local, And then you put all of them together and you encourage hybridity. And from that cross breeding and since capsicum annum breeds it, hybridizes at 90% rate, so it's very easy to do that. He eventually finds a chili that he wants, but he wants a chili that will work in the cannery. That's what he wants. All these long form chilies, these chile chilaca, there are many types. They're in different colors. He said he wants one for the cannery, and he does. He develops that. But what's interesting and what people forgot to say, the New Mexicans, 20th century later, they wanted to make it say that this is their chili. And what Fabian called it, he called it chile nativo. He has a different way of calling it. He doesn't say it's New Mexican. He says it's a native chili, and he was correct because most of the strains that he got were from Chihuahua. Only one of the strains was a local chili strain from New Mexico. One was New Mexican via California, because already in California they were being very successful with that chili. So basically only one of them was an actually local chili. The rest, 80% of the genome, of the genetic selection he was working for was Mexican. Fast forward 20th century, that is all forgotten. They describe the chili that he ends up doing becomes the base of now what we have is industrial chili. Because of the qualities of the shoulders, it's easy to peel and easy to can. That they kept those, what he was able to isolate, they have kept that in the chili. And but what happens is that the molecular biologist will end up, this is I'm going to get some angry mail, I'm sure. He ends up creating what is called the Chili Institute, the Chili Pepper Institute. He says, oh, Fabian, what he did was an accident. Was an accident. He's the founder of this and he discovered this by accident. And no, that's not correct. Because what Darwin knew and what the Darwinists knew was that although they could not describe the genetic mechanism by which traits were inherited, its occurrence was completely predictable. And hence something you could rely on for a certain result. And so, and in fact, Liberty Hyde Bailey, there's this whole debate on, I can't remember his name, an English geneticist had this whole discussion, and basically they're saying they were aware of that. They said, yes, but we're going to do this anyway because it works, and we know that it is statistically highly likely that you will get a certain result. So you could infer that effect quite easily. It's equally scientific, but it is not using Mendel's strategy where he tries to isolate traits individually. And Bailey, Liberty Hyde Bailey said, it's an illusion to think that if you only isolate one trait, you're going to get the cultivar you want, because he was already aware for native squashes and other native plants, their DNA was very complex. So even if you select for one characteristic, there's 20 others you're going to need to make that a viable plant, right? To make it something you actually want to eat, right? And so he said, so that was a debate between the Mendelians and the Darwinists. But what was interesting is that how, a molecular geneticist, because that's the guy who took over the institute, these are the winners of genetic science at that time, right? And at that point, evolutionary biology was, what? Who cares about that? Now it's totally changed, We're gone through a whole other cycle where, evolutionary biology is really important, and realize, so that's this incredible history. But what's interesting in New Mexico, what he did was a mistake. It was an accident. It's serendipity, he says. And I said, oh no. That, and I go in quite detail by explaining the Darwinian point of view of how this is completely scientific, but it's a completely different approach. Now, they didn't like Liberty Hyde Bailey's method because it took so long to get a stable hybrid. Hybrids always want to revert to the parental form. You can create RNA hybrids quite easily, but DNA hybrids where you end up where that trait lasts beyond the third generation, that's much harder to do. You can do it, but it takes I explained that homozygous breeding and so forth, but you can do it, but it's much more difficult. People wanted cultivars fast. Industrial agriculture is taking off, and that's the other thing that's really important here. Fabian is looking at California, where this is agricultural miracle of industrial agriculture, not relying on grain like the Midwest, but relying on fruits and vegetables. And already it's becoming clear, and Fabian said if New Mexico is going to have its own kind of domestic agriculture, they're looking at California, and he's quite aware of what's happening in California. And so fruits and vegetables, it's like brilliant. And so there's a whole economic history there. But so I was just showing. Then later, by we get to the 21st century, Chile, from overplanting so long, is becoming sick. And then people try to develop a GMO chili, and from that you get a whole battle over chili from the native growers, Anglo growers, native Pueblo growers, the Mexican growers. They fight against the state university where Fabian had made famous for his chili. Now they're at war with each other, and eventually that experiment fails. Thank God. They weren't able to do a glyphosate-resistant chili or Roundup Ready resistant chili, and they wanted to do that just to eliminate any weeds so that the chili could grow better. But the chili was already under assault from whenever you plant a cultivar in one place too long, you invite all its enemies, all its pathogens, all the insects that eat it, everything, right? And then we're going through a historic drought, right? And so their strategy was to create this chili that you could harvest by machine, that would be herbicide tolerant, okay, and to do it in a completely industrial way, but it failed. So it's like, and so there's a whole story there. There's more about that, how that happened, and how these people imagined Chile, because capitalism has its own poetics as well. Right, they have their own imaginary of what a thing is, and that's what I talk about. So that's what. So I think we're ready to eat.
Thank you. Thank you so much again, Beyond Baroque, and thank you, Victor, for this wonderful book. And it's I really recommend you dip into it. It's so rich.
Yeah, a little at a time, with a little chocolate, and a little chinito on the side.
A little Chilean chocolate on the side. Up next, I think we're going to have our chef say a few words about tonight's menu.
Hi, everybody. Hello.
Okay, I'll give you the microphone here.
This works?
We'll just do this.
Hello. Hi, can you guys hear me? Hi, my name is Juan Carlos Antonio. I'm with Oaxaca, California. We've been in the business of making Oaxacan food for about 20 years now. Plus, we started off as neveros, ice cream makers, and we slowly started doing Oaxacan cuisine, mole, clayudas, los tamales oaxaqueños. So for tonight, we got a tamal de salsa roja using un chile guajillo and a bit of chile de árbol, give it a little kick, wrapped in a banana leaf, and the masa is corn masa. It's gluten-free, and also it is without lard, so pork-free. Next up, we got the mole, our specialty. Mole negro consists of chile ancho. We toast it, we dry it, and we do a lot of chiles of, not just that chile, but also a bit of garlic, onion, chocolate. So that's the typical Oaxacan black mole sauce. To end the night, we're gonna do a chile de agua, we call it. So that's found, a lot of chile de agua is found in Oaxaca. They call it agua because it looks almost like it's just watered down, like just silky. We're gonna stuff that with Oaxacan cheese, quesillo, and we're gonna put a salsa made of chile de serrano with a bit of tomato. So I hope you guys enjoy tonight. Again, Oaxaca, California. We're inside Mercado La Paloma in the USC area, so please give us a visit. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all so much. We have books across the hall in our bookstore, and feel free to join us outside for a bit of food. Thank you. Shout out to all our team. Thank you all.